Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we're taking an updated look at DDR4 versus DDR5 memory using the new Intel Core i9-14900K because, you know, it's a 13900K. Anyway, not important. Now, the last time I compared DDR4 and DDR5 memory was 2 years ago using the Core i9-12900K in 41 games. And back then I used DDR5 6000 and then compared that to DDR4 3600. Today though, we're moving to a little faster memory, DDR5 7200 and DDR4 4000. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by MSI's new range of GeForce RTX 40 series gaming slim graphics cards, designed to deliver exceptionally fast performance for gamers and creators, but without the big bulky coolers that we've become accustomed to. The thinner and lighter design allows for hassle-free installation and better compatibility. All models are available in either black or white designs and take advantage of the latest Trifroza 3 cooler with Torx 5.0 fans, a nickel-plated copper base plate with up to 8 heat pipes. Then, thanks to Nvidia's Ada Lovelace architecture, you get AI-powered DLSS 3 and class-leading ray tracing support, along with competitive features such as reflex. So to learn more about the all-new MSI GeForce RTX 40 series gaming slim graphics cards, please click the links in the video description. Okay, so in a bit of a role reversal, the DDR4 memory now costs quite a bit more than DDR5. Not sure I saw that coming so quickly. Anyway, the G.Skill Ripjaws V-Series 32GB DDR4 4000 cell 16 kit, that costs $170 US, while the G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB Series 32GB DDR5 7200 cell 34 kit, bit of a mouthful these memory kits. Anyway, the DDR5 kit, it's $130 US. Now, today's video is less about should you pair an LGA 1700 processor with DDR4 or DDR5 memory, and instead we're coming at this one more out of interest than anything. How does DDR4 compare to the newer DDR5 standard in modern games? And anyway, the buying advice on this one's pretty straightforward for new system builders. Just get DDR5, as it's generally faster and doesn't cost much more. For example, you can purchase a 32GB DDR5 5600 kit for $70 these days, while DDR4 3600 costs at least $55. Meanwhile, DDR4 and DDR5 boards often cost about the same amount, with DDR5 models now easier to find. Anyway, let's see how much difference there is between premium DDR4 and DDR5 memory kits using the Core i9-14900K. We've got 21 games to go over, so let's get into it. First up, we have Assassin's Creed Mirage, and here DDR5 is offering up to 13% greater performance, seen when looking at the 1% lows at 1080p, though we're only looking at a 7% boost to the average frame rate. Just for reference sake, we have some 1440p and 4K data as well, but obviously, as we become more GPU limited, CPU memory performance doesn't play a key role. Essentially, if this was a game where you required around 200 FPS, DDR5 would give you the best chance of hitting that FPS target, even with a much lower end GPU, as you'd simply dial down the graphical quality settings. And this is often something people miss when they complain about us using RTX 4090s for removing the GPU bottleneck, or at least minimizing it. Because if you do have a slower GPU and you still want a high frame rate, well, you're just going to lower the graphical quality settings, aren't you? Anyway, enough about that, we'll move on. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, it isn't a hugely memory sensitive title, and you really have to be driving some pretty high frame rates before DDR5 comes into its own. At 1080p, the DDR5 7200 configuration was 9% faster, so a decent margin there. Horizon Zero Dawn's not fussed about which memory you use, DDR4 4000 or DDR5 7200, both work well and get the most out of the Core i9-14900K. Far Cry 6 also isn't that reliant on memory performance, so we're seeing similar results for the 14900K using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory. F123 also isn't very memory sensitive, and therefore we see little to no difference between the DDR4 and DDR5 memory in this example. The average frame rate performance only saw a very minor bump with DDR5 in ACC, going from just over 160 FPS with DDR4 to just over 170 FPS when using DDR5. It's not really a difference you're going to notice, but DDR5 is enabling the highest level of performance in this title. Watch Dogs Legion is a very CPU demanding title, and here the increased bandwidth of DDR5 really helps out, boosting performance by up to 14% at 1080p, with solid gains also seen at 1440p. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem, and here we find some interesting results. DDR5 was on average 7% faster, but we're seeing much more substantial margins when looking at the 1% lows. Here DDR5 was up to 15% faster, seen when comparing the 1% low performance at 1080p. The Star Wars Jedi Survivor results are a bit extreme as well when looking at the 1% lows. For example, at 1080p, the DDR5 configuration was just 11% faster on average, which admittedly, that's still quite a reasonable margin, but it's nothing like the 35% margin we see when comparing 1% low performance. The margins at 1440p are still quite reasonable as well, though things do become heavily GPU bound at 4K, as you'd expect. The performance increase offered by DDR5 memory in Baldur's Gate 3 is quite substantial. We're looking at a 20 FPS boost at 1080p and 1440p, which is a nice 14% increase, and we're looking at similar margins for the 1% lows. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 looks to play well using DDR4 memory, with no real difference here between the two memory standards. We're looking at a nice 9% boost in Resident Evil 4 at 1080p and 1440p, before the results became expectedly GPU limited at 4K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is getting a bit long in the tooth now, not exactly a modern game, but it is a CPU demanding game, and as such we're seeing quite a substantial performance discrepancy between DDR4 and DDR5 memory, with DDR5 offering up to 26% more performance at 1080p. The Callisto Protocol isn't very CPU demanding, and nor is it memory intensive, and therefore the DDR4 4000 memory is able to deliver similar performance to that of DDR5 at very high frame rates. The Total War Warhammer 3 results are unexpected, as here DDR4 was actually faster than DDR5, delivering up to 10% more performance at 1080p. That said, in the past we have found examples where DDR4 does perform better than DDR5, though this is typically seen in much older games. Now, frame rates are at a premium in Hogwarts Legacy. Every last frame counts with ray tracing enabled, so the 9% performance boost offered by DDR5 is huge, taking us from 70 to 76 FPS, and this is a margin that can be seen even at 1440p. Given how CPU limited Starfield is, you'd probably expect that the faster DDR5 memory would offer more of a performance uplift, but at 1080p, we're looking at just a 7% boost to the average frame rate. Next up, we have The Last of Us Part 1, and I have to admit, I had anticipated that DDR5 would have more of an advantage over DDR4 in this title. That said though, the gains at 1080p can be quite significant, with 1% lows boosted by 17%, though we're only looking at a 9% increase for the average frame rate. It really didn't seem to matter which memory we paired the 14900K with in Halo Infinite, DDR4 4000 or DDR5 7200, both resulted in the exact same frame rates even at 1080p. You probably don't need over 200 FPS to play Hitman 3, so memory performance probably doesn't matter that much here. But if you want to drive as many frames as possible, DDR5 7200 is the way to go, offering 12% greater performance at 1080p. Spider-Man Remastered is well known to take advantage of DDR5 memory, and here we are seeing up to a 20% performance boost, with performance heavily CPU limited, even at 4K, where oddly the largest 1% low margin can be seen. Okay, so we've taken a look at the 21 games tested, and as expected, DDR5 generally offers better gaming performance. But to find out just how much better it is, let's check out the 1080p margins for the average frame rate as well as the 1% lows. Comparing the average frame rate, we found that on average, the DDR5 memory was 7% faster, which really isn't that much, though we did see quite a few double-digit margins. There were of course a handful of games where DDR4 and DDR5 delivered the same or very similar performance, which will bring down the average, and then Warhammer, where DDR5 ended up being 5% slower. That said, many of the larger margins were seen when looking at the 1% lows, so let's go do that now. And here we see when looking at 1% low performance, that on average, the DDR5 memory was 10% faster, and we do see a few examples of 15% or more, with some really big margins seen in Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Overall though, performance was certainly better when using the faster DDR5 memory. And just quickly, for those of you wondering, we did compare DDR4 and DDR5 a few years ago, admittedly using very different memory modules, but we found that on average DDR5 was just 3% faster when comparing the 1% low performance. That said, we did include nearly twice as many games, and a good number of them saw margins of 5% or less. So there you have it, DDR5 typically offers better performance in modern titles, and in particular delivers stronger 1% lows, and is therefore likely to deliver smoother frame time performance. Still, if you already have high quality DDR4 memory, and ideally 32GB of it, it's not a bad idea to invest in a DDR4 LJ1700 motherboard, as performance will still be very good, and let's be real here, for the most part you will be GPU limited in modern games such as Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3 or The Last of Us Part 1 for example. That said, if you are more of an esports type gamer, then you are quite likely to end up CPU limited more often than not, so as always, it depends on stuff like the quality settings you're using, your hardware, and of course the games you're playing. Generally speaking though, if you're building a brand new PC or upgrading your platform, going with DDR5 makes the most sense, as it generally delivers the best performance, and these days doesn't really come at a price premium, so you might as well. I'm also expecting CPU and memory bandwidth demands of future games to increase, much like what we see when comparing titles such as Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Spider-Man Remastered, opposed to older games such as Far Cry 6 for example. Though it won't always be the case that fancy new AAA titles will be noticeably faster when using DDR5 opposed to DDR4, we're probably still some ways away from that being the case. And that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you guys found the testing as interesting as I did. I really enjoyed this one. Also, Floatplane, Patreon, signing up to either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there, so check that out if you're interested. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.